Interesting. Okay, well, we are going to get started. Hopefully we'll have a few more people join, but for those of you who didn't have snow all weekend, you might be thinking about planting. It's getting to be about that season. So we are very pleased to have Casey Rosenberg and Kelly Zahn from Stockbridge, Muncie. This is actually a presentation they provided for National Nutrition Month, and they are on to answer any questions. So we can pause throughout, or feel free to enter your questions into the chat. And with that, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. If you have any trouble with the audio, let me know. But I think we should be good to go. So I am going to go ahead and get started. Oops.
There we go. Okay, so welcome everyone to our talk on plant and produce versatility. If you can mute yourselves, that would be great. And then at the end, we'll have time for some questions, and you can unmute yourself or use the chat box to ask those questions. So I'm Casey Rosenberg. I'm the dietitian at the Stockbridge Muncie Health and Wellness Center. I'm going to let Kelly introduce herself. Hey everybody, my name is Kelly Zahn. I'm the agriculture agent here at the Stockbridge Muncie community, and I manage the community gardens. Okay, so here's just a little overview of some of the things we'll talk about. What grows well together, what grows well in our area, some of the versatility of different produce options, different ways of preserving and preparing your produce that you grow, and what produce tends to have the most nutritional value. We'll also touch on a couple other things. So, okay. Sounds good. Well, I am going to get things started. During the first part of this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about companion planting. So what that really means is planting multiple kinds of produce together to benefit the entire growing system. So there are a number of reasons why we do that. One of those just might be for growing methods, and we're going to touch a little bit on there about those today. Another big benefit of companion planting is making sure that we're bringing pollinators into the garden. So some plants, like beans, are generally self-pollinators. That means that they're pollinated by the wind and sort of fake pollen amongst themselves to set the bean pods. However, other plants like tomatoes, cucumbers, things like that need to have bees come in and help them become pollinated. So that way they set fruit from their flowers. So a lot of times when we can have a diverse mix of things happening in our garden, that looks really enticing and tasty to our bees. So that's another reason why we might be doing some companion planting. Also, there are just some benefits to prevent weeds and insects that happen when we can plant different crops together. So you can go to the next slide. So when I guess primarily think of companion planting, the first thing my mind goes to is the Three Sisters Garden, which I'm sure many people are aware of here. I just wanted to share a little bit about it for anybody who didn't know. So Three Sisters Garden is typically corn, beans, and squash grown together. This is actually a picture from our garden that we have at our farm out on Maple Road. We have some raised rows set up that we planted some Lenape blue corn and a number of varieties of traditional beans. And I feel like from this, the first picture on the last slide, you could see the beans and the corn growing a little bit more together. This picture is a little bit harder to see the beans. But then in between the rows, we have squash growing. And this is really a method that we use to sort of help the whole system. And I think as we learn more about this, it's really cool to see how all of these crops and plants interact with each other. So the corn is always meant to be sort of that strong plant. When you plant pole beans with it, the pole beans tend to crawl up the corn. And then we use the squash here to sort of shade out some of those middle areas to help prevent weeds. So in this garden, we planted our squash on the sides of our mounds, and you can see from that, the squash really wanted to go to where the sunlight was, which is kind of filling in that middle area and our middle paths that we use for walkways. But it's also really nice when we don't have to go through and do a ton of either pulling of weeds and stuff like that to make sure that we're keeping our soil in place. And also, we are trying to grow healthy plants and healthy vegetables, and that's really awesome. But a really important part of growing healthy plants is making sure that we have healthy soil. So when we're not, having to run tillers and stuff through there as much, and we can just let something be on a ground cover, that's really good for all of the soil microbes and the bacteria that are living in soil, that kind of have their own ecosystem going on. So this is just one example. Like I said, I think a lot of people are familiar with it, but it really is cool. And we have a number of Three Sisters gardens scattered throughout the community. So if anybody wants to see them in action, I would definitely invite you to come out and look at them during the summer. And we usually have some different work days where we invite people to come out and help us plant these areas, and help take care of them a little bit. We do end up doing some weeding, but hopefully try to keep that to a minimum when we have all of these plants planted together. Also on the outside of this garden, we had some sunflowers planted. And again, that was to attract some pollinators in, tell those bees, hey, this is an area where there's some good food. So come on in and take a look at it. So we can go to the next slide. Kind of shifting gears a little bit from a Three Sisters garden, I think one of the other really cool things, and as I was doing some more research about companion planting, were some of the benefits that different herbs can have, to help our different crops grow. So there are a ton of varieties, and we'll get some resources a little bit later on in the presentation, but these were 4 that I just thought were really cool and wanted to share with all of you. And also because I think that they, have a good use in our garden and what we're planting, how we're cooking, doing things like that. So would be a great thing to incorporate and think about. So the first one that I wanted to touch on was basil. This is always one of my personal favorites of the summer. Anytime we can get, like a fresh tomato basil salad, I think is delicious. And actually one of the things is that basil actually really helps protect tomato plants from some common insects. Also, one thing that I did not realize while I was putting this together and doing some more research on it is that basil can also help keep mosquitoes at bay. So, hey, a little fun fact, put some basil in your salad, plant it next to your tomatoes, and hopefully help keep some mosquitoes at bay if you have a mosquito problem in your yard as well. But that's just one of the cool ways that different plants can help each other grow. So another one of those cool plants that we're looking at was thyme. I didn't realize this either, but it can actually help deter potato beetles. So I don't know if anybody has grown potatoes. I feel like I have constantly had huge issues with potato beetles and potato bugs in the garden. Oh my goodness. It's crazy when you're trying to go around and squash all of them. So maybe planting some herbs next to potatoes would be a really good way to sort of help protect your potatoes from some of those other plants. Also, I've noticed that I often have potato beetles, potato bugs on my eggplants as well. So another one of those things that you could plant in your garden. Sage is another one that I wanted to touch on. And this has some really big benefits for cabbage and actually everything in the Brassica family. So that would be things like cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, things like that. Because it really can help deter from some of the, sorry, I'm like trying to click on the screen, trying to click on it. I'm like, oh yeah, it's Casey's screen. Because it can deter away from some of the white cabbage beetles. When they lay their eggs, they can really start chewing away at your cabbage and other brassicas. So that is, again, something fun to try. And the last one here I wanted to touch on were chives. So actually when chives are planted by carrots, they can really help the carrots improve their flavor and growth. I don't know, some people I feel like have really good luck at growing carrots. I tend to struggle with growing carrots, so I think I might try this one for the future. Making sure that our carrots are growing nice and strong. And then also, once your chives are growing, you want to harvest them. You can make it into a tea. So again, cutting some of those chives, mixing it with some water, and it is said that it can help if you spray it on cucumbers or potentially other squash to help prevent powdery mildew. Again, it really depends on the year. Sometimes like how many disease issues we have. If it tends to be a hot, humid year, disease tends to be more of a problem, especially in those like cucumber, squash, melony type things. So that is one thing that you have done. And then I saw that there was a question in the chat. I have not tried this method with my potatoes yet, but I actually think that I might. So I think one of the potential challenges about thyme is that it is a perennial crop, but then I was like, ooh, well, maybe we could put this in pots and maneuver it around the garden strategically. So that way we can sort of help keeping it go on. So, yeah. All right, next slide. So one of the, I guess, also things to be aware about is when some plants do really well when they're grown together, but also kind of on the flip side of that, sometimes it helps when we keep plants away from each other. So just one of the examples that I wanted to bring up were cucumbers. As I was, again, doing some more reading about this, it really sounded like cucumbers did not like herbs that much, especially dill, which is maybe ironic because I feel like we often put, dill, pickles, cucumbers, I think about those things together, but they can actually really hinder the growth of each other. And then also keeping your tomatoes away from those brassica crops again, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, they tend to not do well. Even radishes are in that family. So keeping those things away from each other, and also keeping them away from potatoes, just because potatoes and tomatoes are in similar growth families. So then sometimes they can like swap diseases in between each other, which can be a potential problem. And it's also one of the things that when we think about, laying out farms, gardens, things like that, making sure that we're aware of where crops were planted the year before. So that way we're making sure that we're not making a host for diseases for the plants for the future. So again, just being aware of how you're moving things around your garden. I mean, I have a little garden at home, and I typically, it's a small space, so things just tend to be planted near each other. But I would say if you can keep them, yep, I saw a question in the chat, how far apart are you talking about? I would say, just making sure that they're not right next to each other. So, if you have a row of cucumbers, for example, in one spot, then maybe putting a row of beans there can sometimes be beneficial to plants like cucumbers would be more helpful. And then having the herbs a little bit further away. So I know it all sort of depends on your space. Next slide. And then I just want to touch on just some really good resources, just for growing in general. Hello? So just some good resources for growing in general. Like companion, as we're talking about companion planting, and also just good, as you're talking about like laying out your garden and potentially when to plant your crops. I always have a copy of the Old Farmer's Almanac that changes every year, but I think it has a really good resource of saying, like, again, talking about companion plantings, but also when to plant, by like the moon and weather cycles and things like that. One of the books that I have purchased was Why Carrots Love Tomatoes. This book is a fantastic resource. It was one thing I bought it off of Amazon, I think on the Kindle. It was only $10, but it is full of information, just going through a variety of different plants, herbs, even going into like some wild plants and things like that, and more like decorative plants and how those can be helpful or harmful to your garden. So that would be another really good resource. And then another one that I haven't personally checked out, but when I was talking to the folks over at Seed Savers Exchange. That's where we ended up getting a lot of our traditional seeds from our garden, recommended great garden companions. Again, another just resource of, where to go. And if you're interested in, I would definitely recommend checking out some of these books just to take a little deep dive into what we're doing. So I think that's it for mine.
So now moving more into the nutrition side of things and like the preservation and culinary side of things. So when you're looking at produce and what you can kind of grow at home, you basically have three different areas. You have your fruits, your vegetables, and your herbs. All of these food groups are foods that are generally packed with vitamins, minerals, fiber, flavors. They're just generally healthy foods. So, your fruits can be great when they're picked at that peak of freshness, but you can't ever seem to replicate that throughout the year. But, there's ways of preserving things that we can kind of lock in some of those flavors. They can be great when preserved in the off season. You can freeze fruits, dehydrate them, can them. They can also be good made into jam, sauces, smoothie kits that you can enjoy throughout the off season. As far as vegetables, obviously there's so many options of vegetables in the growing season, whether you're, growing all of these options yourself, or if you're part of a CSA program, or you're just heading to the farmer's market. There's so many things. So I encourage you to try different things. Fresh salads and raw veggies are great during this time of season. They can make great side dishes. Obviously, like grilling your vegetables can be a good option. Nice healthy way to cook things. And then, you can again preserve those for the off season via freezing, dehydrating, canning, pickling. So a lot of options for vegetables. And then our fresh herbs. Obviously, fresh herbs are great during the summer season, but many times those can also be transported inside your home. And if you have the kind of right environment inside your home, they can continue to grow well throughout the winter months and off season. So, if you're able to keep them in, a warm place that's well lit and, adequate moisture level, you can definitely keep those plants going into the colder months. Obviously, herbs can add a freshness to any food they're added to. They're a great low or no sodium option. So if you're watching your sodium intake, using fresh herbs or preservatives can be a great flavoring tip. And then, as far as preserving herbs, obviously you can dry them yourself, either like a hang dry method or in a dehydrator or in your oven. You can freeze them, like freezing them in a little bit of olive oil is a nice trick, because then you can just pop it out of like an ice cube tray and toss it in to saute any recipes with afterwards. And then you can also make them into sauces like a pesto, and again, freeze or can that.
I'm going to pause here for a second. I don't know if you guys saw in the chat, there was a question, what is the best time to plant herbs? And I know you may have hit on that a little bit with Casey's discussion about being able to move those in and out with the weather. But any other thoughts before we move on that one?
Yeah, I was just like, typing a response back. Typically, when I think about planting herbs, a lot of the times I think about planting those in the spring, especially I know there was some talk about basil in the chat. Those annual crops, things like basil, cilantro, dill, those are all things that I typically end up planting in the spring. Two, when I've done chives in the past, I've also done them in the spring. I'm not sure how they work in the fall when ones are more like annuals and stuff like that. But I would say, I guess my best advice to you, typically in the spring, if you have an herb that you are in particular looking for, when you buy those seeds, they should say specifically when they want them planted on the seed packet. But general rule of thumb, spring.
And while we're stopped, any other questions? I don't see anything else in the chat other than us raving. That's so cool about the dill and the cucumbers and then tomato basil is, it's just kind of interesting how that works out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I don't see anything else. I will restart here.
Okay, so moving a little further into some of those preservation methods that I was just talking about, there's kind of four big ones. There's pickling, canning, freezing, and dehydrating. And they, they're all good, healthy methods. We'll start with pickling. Most people think of pickling and they think vegetables. It lends itself to a long shelf-stable life when pickled. You don't need a pressure canner for pickling things because of the brine that you put in. You don't need to monitor that pressure level. So if you don't have pressure canners, pickling can be a great way to go. You can also do something called like a quick pickle if you want it like fresh right away in the summer, where it's usually just a brine mixture that you put over whatever produce you're looking to pickle, and then let it sit for anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes, and then you have it ready right away to go. So I like to use like a quick pickle for things like red onions for tacos or Southwestern dishes, quick pickle for like a carrot salad, something like that. So it doesn't always have to be the full long pickling process. It can be like a quick pickle as well. And now, if you are watching your sodium intake, it is important to think about that when you're pickling. You can, when you're pickling yourself, you are in control a bit of the sodium intake, so you can kind of monitor that. But if you're watching your sodium intake, it may be better to just go with like a canned option over the pickled option. But you can also rinse your pickled products after you open the jars up, and that'll help reduce the sodium intake a little bit too. But just something to think about with pickled products. So then canning, canning can seem a little bit scary to people at times because you do have to watch, certain temperatures and times and pressures and things like that. But the tribe usually tends to offer, and the communities around us tend to offer some canning classes each season. So, if you're looking to get into canning, I would definitely recommend looking for one of those classes as they kind of teach you the basics of it. A lot of great resources online to, check YouTube out, all those kind of things to kind of help. And maybe you've just been doing it for years and you're super comfortable. Once you get the hang of it, it's definitely not as scary as it might be when you start. So the nice thing about canning is you can really do any variety of foods. You can do your fruits, your vegetables. You can even do proteins like canned venison, which is seems to be a favorite of people. You can can sauces and jams, jellies, all those kind of things. So some kind of classic canned things that we tend to see a lot are things like canned potatoes, green beans, like stewed tomatoes that you can use later for dishes, tomato sauces or like a marinara sauce, salsas, canned beets, all those kind of things really hold up well to canning. So again, with canning, just remembering that, depending on what produce you're canning, you need to can it to for a certain amount of time, to a certain amount of pressures. And that's where like a pressure canner usually comes in handy when you're doing that. And then moving on to freezing. This can be a really good option, especially if you do have like an extra freezer or a large freezer outside of just your refrigerator freezer. Freezing produce is great because it's a way to process the produce without adding any sodium or fat to it. It can be a quick process. Some produce does require that you blanch it before you freeze it, and others you can just wash, trim, and then freeze as is. Vacuum sealing can be really nice when you think about freezing as well. And any items that you see in your grocery store freezer area, you can do that at home as well. So any produce you like really can be frozen. It's just thinking about if it needs to be blanched or partially cooked first. Some things people might not think about that you can freeze. Things like you can dice up your onions. If you grow onions, you can dice those up and freeze them. You can parboil beets and dice them up and freeze them. They make a great like breakfast hash for doing something like that. Sweet corn, and you can do that. You can freeze the top whole, or you can cut it off and make a mixture and freeze that as well. Berries freeze really well. With those, I personally like separate my berries on a sheet pan and then freeze them, and then you put them in a container together, as they don't stick together as much as if you just freeze them all in one bag right away. Another great thing to think about is smoothie packs. These can make a great breakfast or quick meal or a quick snack. So you can make these up throughout the year, but I like to make mine in the summer when you have that ripe produce. So, I get blueberries and strawberries and fresh spinach, and you can portion them out into individual bags. You can add any produce or fruit that you like in there. And again, they hold up well in the freezer for months. And then it's just something you can quick grab out, add your liquid to it, maybe some yogurt, and you have a nice quick meal. Doing things like spiralized or riced vegetables as an alternative to pasta. If you want something lower carb, you can spiralize and freeze things like carrots, zucchini, squash, and then you can just toss them in the freezer. When you're looking to do a pasta dish, you could sub that in. Another thing is cauliflower. You can rice that and freeze that, and then it's ready to go, and you can substitute that for rice dishes. And then other things like sauces, you can freeze as well. So things like pesto, tomato sauce, jams, those all you can do in the freezer if you don't have, a means to can. And then lastly is dehydration. I feel like a lot of people necessarily don't think about this one, but you can do this either with a dehydrator or you can do it in your oven. The times and temperatures just vary a little bit depending on which process you're using, but this can be great for fruits. They make dried fruits make really good snacks, especially for kids. Dried vegetables are good because you can rehydrate them later in soups and stews and things like that. And then also dried herbs and even meat. Like you can make beef jerky or venison jerky, and you can dry your herbs as well. And then you have them ready to go for those off-season months. Okay, then looking at cooking methods. So how can you prepare these things that you get in the summer? Like I said, it's great to eat them fresh and raw. Having a nice salad, cutting up the fruit or vegetables to just have as snacks on hand can be great. Even when you think about your salads, maybe making a homemade vinaigrette with that, using some of your fresh herbs or, fresh citrus fruits that you maybe can get. And then doing things like fresh side dishes, shred or shave up vegetables and make a little like salad with it. Carrots are great for that. You can shave asparagus, using the ends of your broccoli and shaving that, and you can make it into a little salad is, a really great thing, or adding it to a side dish as meals. Doing things like Kelly was talking about, like a fresh caprese salad. You can get your herbs and your tomatoes, all of that. And then even making like cold soups that people don't really think about. But, like a cold berry soup can be great in the summer as a dessert or as a breakfast. Things people don't really think about. So next, moving on, looking at roasting or grilling. Obviously, grilling is a preferred method in the summer months. It's a really nice, healthy, lean method of cooking. The same thing with roasting. Roasting is my personal favorite for preparing vegetables because they just get nice and crispy. You can usually just use a little bit of olive oil and season to your liking. If you like just simple, you can just do salt, pepper, a little olive oil, or you can get more creative with it and do Cajun or spicy themed ones, or even doing like sweet ones. I like to roast chickpeas and toss them with a little bit of cinnamon, things like that. So it's essentially just high dry heat that helps get that produce nice and crispy. Usually, you want to toss it with a little bit of olive oil and seasoning. So a few ideas when you think about roasting. Brussels sprouts are great roasted, or any of those cruciferous vegetables are really great roasted. Add a little Italian seasoning, a little Parmesan to that. Roasted carrots are great. You can toss a little maple syrup on them. As far as grilling, thinking about like grilled fruits, those can be a great treat in the summer. Doing things like cutting pineapple spears up if you have pineapple around and grilling that. It brings out those natural sugars in those foods when you kind of cook them a little bit. Also, like peaches or pears on the grill, get some sear marks on them. Those can make great options too. And then lastly, just steaming or boiling. This is a really quick, easy method. You can do this either on a stovetop or in the microwave if you're in a hurry. It's healthy because usually you just use a little bit of water. You pretty much can just cut up whatever you're wanting to steam and add about a half cup of water to it. A lot of times you want to cover it so that the steam can create in that pot or bowl that you're using, and then it's ready to go, and you can kind of cook it to your texture preference. If you like it a little more well done, or if you like it al dente, that's up to you. But super easy and healthy way of cooking produce. Yeah, like I said, one of the great things about preserving your own fruits and vegetables is that you can control how much sugar and salt you put in. You don't have to add any extra for things like freezing. If you're making your own jams and jellies, you can control the sugar content of those things. So it's just another perk of doing some of these things yourself. Okay, so now when we're thinking about produce, like what gets you the most bang for your buck? What are the most nutrient dense foods out there? So kind of the top 5 picks are sweet potatoes and pumpkin, those nice bright orange produce items, beans and legumes, your kales and your dark leafy greens, berries and beets. So nutrient dense foods are what you want to shoot for in your diet. We want to avoid the calorie dense foods and try to shift to the nutrient dense foods. And that's most of this produce that you are going to be growing or purchasing locally in the summer months. But the nutrient dense foods tend to be lower in calories and they're higher in nutrients. You can grow many of these right in your own home, or you can pick them up at your local produce stand or market. All of these foods that I just have listed here, they're all high in levels of vitamin A, B, C, D, E, and K. They have high levels of calcium, which people don't usually tend to think about in produce items, but a lot of these vegetables are high in calcium, especially your dark leafy greens and things like that. Good iron values, especially out of a non-meat source. So if you're not that big into meat, hitting some of these key produce items could help you with your iron intake. All these have really high fiber intake. Fiber is great anytime you can get more fiber in your life. Obviously, it can help with your GI system. It also helps pull cholesterol out of our body. So if you're someone that struggles with maybe an elevated lipid panel, increasing your fiber intake can help pull some of that extra cholesterol out of your diet. And also magnesium, potassium. Other great nutrient dense food options that I don't have listed here are things like garlic, salmon, liver, nuts. All those things kind of give you the most bang for your buck when you're thinking about foods and what you should kind of lean towards. So that is the end of our presentation, but we have time to answer any questions, Kelly or myself, about anything we talked about, or if you have other ideas, feel free to pop them in the chat box, or otherwise you can unmute yourself and ask.
I'm going to go ahead and play the questions from the first session, and then we'll pause and then open it up for questions for our group. So if you want to just listen for a minute, and then we will get an opportunity to ask questions.
This is Leslie. Do you have any canning classes in the future?
We're going to be planning on having some canning classes through the ag department this summer. So it'll probably be, we might start doing like a pickling class or something like that in maybe like July, and then looking for some tomato canning classes in the late summer, early fall.
Then I have another question about your sister garden. I'd like to do that. Could you send me an email on how you started that? Because I think that's a great idea.
Sure.
I do corn and it never worked for me. So maybe if I do that, it'll work.
Yeah. So a lot of the times, there are a number of different ways, and I've seen people have success with it in, a number of ways, shapes, places. I think the key is to make sure that you have, varieties that you want to grow in there. We've been having really good luck with this Lenape blue corn. It's really cool. I have a bunch of seeds behind me. So if anybody wants any of those seeds, I can definitely get some to you. But that just grows really well for our climate here. The hardest thing about that corn is that it's not super tall. So sometimes, pole beans will generally climb up anything that they can get their hands around. So sometimes you got to be making sure that you're watching the planting densities and stuff like that. But yeah, I would be happy to get you in touch with, and I think we have some videos on it too, of what we have done in the past, and can share those with you. And if you would like any seeds, let me know.
Jenny, you had asked, is that high in sugar? What was that in regards to? Oh, smoothies. Smoothies definitely don't need to be high in sugar. Sometimes maybe some of the pre-processed ones might be a little bit higher, but when you're making them yourself, they really aren't. You can just use, fresh fruit or like a frozen fruit. I would avoid like a canned high syrup fruit because that would add more sugar. But otherwise, I like to do, about half cup of fruit. And then you can also put some other veggies in there, and that will help bring the sugar content down as well. And use an unsweet yogurt, like a plain Greek or a plain regular yogurt, because that'll add protein for you. And then you're not adding sugar of a flavored yogurt to it. And then whatever liquid you like to do, you can do, a milk or a milk alternative, or you can do water. So those are all relatively low in sugar. So as long as you're kind of using products that are low in sugar, you can keep the sugar content down. And also, if you're doing fruit and produce in there, that it does have sugar in, but it's like a healthier form of sugar because the natural form of sugar, and your body can digest that more easily. So they tend to be pretty low in sugar. Yeah, Lucy, that's a great comment. She's a big fan of freezing smoothie kits and also soup starters and omelet starters. So all different things that people just sometimes don't think about. So sometimes I just get fresh ideas about things. Kelly, did you see Wendy's question?
I see that. I'm trying to find my pepper page. That way I can give you the best information I have on there. So I've often heard that peppers and tomatoes don't grow super well together. I'm just trying to look to see if there's anything on here that says, hey, these could be really good. So just I have my book pulled up, the Carrots Love Tomatoes book, and it says the general requirement of sweet peppers are surprisingly like those of basil, so plant them together. Sweet peppers also grow well with okra. I've never grown that. I don't even know if that grows well here. This book was written from somebody who I think lives in Oklahoma, since they're brittle plants. So, but yeah, I would just say I guess the main things when I'm thinking about growing things like peppers, tomatoes, stuff like that, is again, making sure that they're in a good, healthy soil. So if you can get some compost down, that generally gets them off to a good start. And then also making sure that they have an adequate amount of water. So those plants can also have some pretty significant water requirements. If you can water them, like with a drip line or a soaker hose, that tends to be better. Out in the garden, we water them over the top and they seem to be fine, but sometimes that can be hard on plants. How close together? So I think a lot of times if you're thinking about closeness, and it really depends on how people's gardens are set up. So I tend to do my gardens in sort of clusters, I guess. So if you have like a total of 6 pepper plants or 10 or 12 pepper plants in your garden, and maybe for every 3 or 4 spaces that you would be planting a pepper plant, maybe try a basil plant in there instead, just to try to help them be in and amongst each other. Okay, any other questions or comments?
I'm going to pause here so that we can have an opportunity as the live audience to ask any questions. I did see there were a couple of comments in the chat. I know Linda mentioned as far as freezing fruits and vegetables that she does vacuum freezing, finds that it has a better quality product at the end. And I know of course, we all know there is some freezer burn with some freezer bags. So definitely a good option. And then just a comment from Alicia that she left, just that she's looking forward to gardening and that she gardens with her son to pass down that knowledge to him. And I think that's I love to hear that. I think that's what we're really hoping for, is that this becomes something the family can do. It's a family activity, and certainly at this stage where prices are increasing, it's a great way of having some produce available to you that is a little lower cost, just a little bit of sweat equity in that. So love to see that comment. So now is a chance if anyone else on the call has any questions that weren't asked already, or you had any other comments about your gardening or what you plant. We're opening up either use the chat or unmute yourself and feel free to ask questions. Here's one, and then this might be a good one for Kelly. As a public health worker, how can I encourage our tribal communities to start gardens?
That is a great question. So I feel like, I feel like every community sort of has their own journey. I started working for the tribe here about 5 years ago. There had been some community gardens out in the past that I think, from my understanding, people in community health sort of helped run, maintain to some point in time. But obviously the people in community health have a ton of other responsibilities that you guys are working with all the time too. So that really is a challenge. I think if a community is able to invest in an agriculture department and building an agriculture program, so that way you can have a specific point person to sort of go to and help organize events and activities around it, I think is really helpful. And other tribal communities that I've talked to, things just seem to work better when you have a specific person devoted to a task. And you're not, asking your community health reps to wear multiple hats and then choosing priorities of which of those are important. So now, and our community gardens have really changed over time. So at first, some of our community gardens started off with growing a variety of vegetables, was really working on encouraging people to come out to the garden and help. We would occasionally have work days and sometimes people would come, but that wasn't a huge success. So we ended up transitioning a number of those community gardens into Three Sisters gardens. And those really seem to engage the community a little bit more and having specific days. So I like a Three Sisters garden because I feel like it's less maintenance than a vegetable garden with everything in it. And it gives us specific opportunities to say, hey, we are meeting out at the garden behind the education office today. If anybody wants to come out and help us weed, water, plant, harvest, to do all of those things, that we can have specific days and times that we're doing those. And then it also creates that sort of cultural connection behind your food as well. So like, for example, this week we had a class we were growing our blue corn. We had a class about making blue corn mush. So now people, a number of the people who had been helping in the gardens last summer came to the class where we were making blue corn and said, hey, you guys helped us grow this food. And now we're here able to eat it, share it with the people in our class, share it with the youth at the community center. And people are already asking like, hey, how can we get more of that? What are we doing? So it really has been a slow build in finding what works for you. But I would definitely say, I think it starts with having a point person who is in charge and responsible for making these things run. In a perfect world, everybody would be coming out to the community gardens, saying, yes, let's do it. Life is very busy, and that's not always the way it works. So when you can have somebody who's really coordinating those roles, I think it's very helpful.
Kelly, did you do container gardening last year?
Yes. So we have done a number of classes like that in the past, where I always call them, usually in the spring, we roll out with these seed starting classes. So in a number of different ways. So we did, pre-COVID. Now with COVID, we were doing them virtually, but I'm thinking we can get back to doing them in person, but connecting with people, starting a couple of different plants. And then later on in the spring, around mid-May or so, having an opportunity, getting these like reusable bags or sometimes totes that we can fill with soil and then work with people in the community. We would always do them at our family center to say, hey, here's a bag, here's the size of container, here is what would be a good fit for that container. And those have really worked well in just making sure that people can grow produce at their own homes. So, and it's usually some low maintenance things, you know, like whether it's lettuce, spinach, beans, you know, tomatoes, things like that work really well in containers.
Yeah, and I think if you guys are just starting out a garden, it's might be a good option, or bringing gardening to the community might be a good option to start with something like that, so people can see that, hey, they can do it. They don't have to start with a huge plot of land or anything. But I was also going to mention too, I know here we've done some very target audience specific things. So it maybe as you're just getting into some of the gardening in your community, picking an audience, you know, like working with the youth at a gardening project or something like that, kind of can make it more manageable steps until you can bring more things together. I was also going to mention, and I don't know, this is up here, we have some master gardeners that have to volunteer. So they are willing to come and help you out. I don't know if that's just a up north thing or if that's something that you guys might have too as well, but that might be an option for you as well as you're starting something in the communities. Let's see, and then we've got, oh, love that class. Would love that class. I'm not sure which one you mean, Linda, because there's a lot of great ones I think would be amazing to go to. Oh, the container garden, yep. And I know someone mentioned the raised beds earlier too. I don't know if you have any advice about that or any thoughts, how often you are seeing those used or.
Yeah, I think that raised beds are another really great option. Again, you know, especially if depending on where people living, the soil around their house, you know, not always the best. Up here or where we are, there tends to be a lot of sand. So sometimes growing a garden in the ground can really be a challenge. And you can generally, well, I mean, I will say this relatively speaking, because I feel like all building supplies are just really expensive right now. But you can usually find some pretty reasonable raised bed gardens, you know, at places like any hardware store, like a Menards, Home Depot, whatever, name your places like that, or even on Amazon, that you can sort of clip together, build yourself, and then fill that with a soil mix. So a lot of times also at those gardening centers, there is a specific potting mix specifically for raised bed gardens. And that's really important because you're sort of creating your own ecosystem, you know, in this new space. So you don't always want to be taking, you know, dirt from the ground and putting it in your raised bed. That's not, or yeah, in your raised bed, that's not going to be like what's best for it. So I would get some specific soil that is for raised bed gardens and get a good growing area in there. And it can just be a great little way to contain a space. But I also know people with like back, hip, knee issues that, you know, getting down on the ground isn't always a feasible option for people, but they still really enjoy growing their own vegetables. I was out at a lady's place who like literally, it was the coolest thing. She had a block of a raised bed garden that she could just go around in. I mean, it was like a 20 by 30 foot square. It was so cool. So, I mean, she was really rocking and rolling in there. When you're doing things with raised beds or containers, just you really need to watch the water on them. I feel like they need to be watered more than something in the ground. So just advice, pro tips. I don't know.
Excellent. And we've got just another comment came in about using Rubbermaid, that some friends that don't have gardening space have been able to use the Rubbermaid totes, and yeah, perfect container.
Yeah, I think that definitely works. Any kind of containers like that. Usually if people are growing in plastic, I recommend that you drill a couple of holes in the bottom so that way the water can pass through. Otherwise, if you do get too much water, if you have a big rain event, it can really flood those areas if it doesn't have a way to drain.
So many pro tips. Yes. Any other questions, comments? Okay, not seeing anything come in. I just want to thank you both, Kelly and Casey, for taking the time to join us today, and thank you for putting together the presentation. Amazing. I think it's really a great time for us to be thinking about it, and just kind of some of those little tips you gave us are really appreciated. So thank you guys again. We appreciate you being here today, and thank you to everyone who joined, and we will let you go. Be sure to check out the next couple of sessions we're having in May, and hope to see you there as well. So have a great day.